For a little bit of history, the Strand was founded by my grandfather, Benjamin Bass, in 1927, a block from here along 4th Avenue. It was an area called Book Row, and at its height, it housed 48 used bookstores. It spanned from Union Square to Astor Place. In the 92 years since then, all the stores have shuttered except for here. And thanks to you voracious readers, we're still family-owned and thriving. Tonight, I'm excited to welcome friend of the Strand, Steve Israel. He's a former United States representative for New York's 3rd Congressional District, having served in the U.S. Congress from 2001 until 2017. So for 16 years. He's here tonight to discuss the Big Guns, a hilarious novel of local and national politics that takes aim at lobbyists, businessmen, politicians tussling over the right to bear arms. It follows his first novel, The Global War on Morris, in pulling from his long experience in politics to deliver a thought-provoking and belly-laughing tale of corruption and cynicism. Steve's fellow satirist, Christopher Buckley, called him the only funny thing to come out of Washington in a long, long time. And I couldn't agree more. I hope you'll join me in welcoming Steve Israel and Big Guns to the Strand.
Well, we're going to have an intimate but enjoyable conversation tonight. It's wonderful to be here at the Strand. This is one of my favorite places in New York City. And I have such a high regard for Nancy. Nancy, her husband is Senator Ron Wyden, a former colleague of mine, who may be the only Democrat in Congress not running for president right now. He's just a wonderful, wonderful guy and a real joy. I'm going to be brief. This is a good opportunity for us just to have a conversation about Washington. I started my day in Washington, D.C. and landed and came here and thought we could just spend a few minutes talking about the book, and then if you have any questions, I'm happy to entertain them. We're videoing, so this will appear on YouTube, which is better than C-SPAN. Let me talk about the book for just a few minutes, and then we'll open it up. I had 3 dreams when I was growing up in Levittown, New York. One was to be a member of the United States Congress, and that dream came true. The second dream was to one day be a novelist, and that dream came true. And the third dream was to be a relief pitcher for the New York Mets, which did not come true, but actually these days it could come true, given the status of their relief pitching. And I learned when I was in Congress, as Nancy said, 16 years in Congress in the Democratic leadership, my relief, my therapy from the pressures of the job was writing. And so I would be on a plane heading to help a member of Congress in his or her district, and I would write. I would be traveling back and forth to my congressional district, and I would write. And for me, it was a great release because whatever issue was brewing, whatever major controversy we were dealing with, I learned that I could deal with it best if I were writing about it. And so my first novel, The Global War on Morris, was a satire of the Bush administration and their handling of the war on terror. And I never expected to see that published. I wrote it, again, as a release, as my therapy, as a hobby, as a passion, and it found its way to an agent, and it found its way to a book, and the reviews were phenomenal. Rob Reiner took it, gave him the option to develop a film. I've learned one thing, Nancy may know this, that when you option a book to Hollywood for a film project, it is the functional equivalent of a bill being referred to committee. Things just tend to languish. But the book did very well, and I learned that, and I continue to believe deeply that satire is a very important way of making a point. Had I tried to make a point on the global war on terror as a dry policy book, maybe my mother would have bought it, but nobody else. But the use of humor, the use of sharp satire to make a point, I think is effective. It draws people into a story without hitting them over the head. In Congress, after the Global War on Morris was published, I became increasingly concerned with the issue of gun violence. While I was in Congress, in 16 years, there were 52 mass shootings. 52 mass shootings while I was in the United States Congress. And after every single one, the most frequently asked question that I received, and that most of my colleagues received, was this: when will you do something about it? When will Congress do something to stop this? And I, in my heart, I knew what the honest answer was, and the honest answer was, we're not. Congress is not going to do anything on this. But I didn't have the heart to tell that to my constituents. And so I decided to write about that, to try and answer that question: why doesn't Congress act on gun violence? By developing this storyline for big guns. Now, the problem I had was I wanted to make a point about the power of the gun lobby, its inescapable grasp on many of my former colleagues, particularly those who are Republican. But I didn't have a storyline. I wanted to talk about the gun lobby. I wanted to talk about the dynamics in Congress. I wanted to make it satirical. I wanted to make it sharp. I wanted to use humor to make a point. The only problem is I didn't have a plot. Until one day, about a week after the shootings in Sandy Hook in Connecticut. Just after that shooting, I saw, as many Americans did, the President of the United States, Barack Obama, weeping in the White House press room in response to those shootings. And I thought, now something's going to happen. Now finally, the House and the Senate, Democrats and Republicans, will join together and pass common sense and meaningful gun safety laws. And days went by and nothing happened. Nothing happened in Washington, D.C. But interestingly, things started happening in state and local governments. States, localities, villages, townships, cities began to pass common sense gun safety measures. And about a week or maybe 2 weeks after the shootings at Sandy Hook, I was sitting in my dining room on Long Island, still trying to grapple with, how do I write this story? How do I tell this story? And I was reading the New York Times, and I'll remember this vividly forever. On page A8, there was a story under the fold about one city's response to the issue of gun safety. The small city of Nelson, Georgia, had become so angry with all of those other state and local governments that were passing ordinances and laws to make guns safer, that it decided that it would go in a different direction. The city of Nelson, Georgia passed an ordinance that required, that mandated, that compelled that every single resident of the city of Nelson, Georgia must own and carry a gun. And I thought that the editors of The Onion had infiltrated the New York Times. I was like, how is this possible? But the editors of The Onion did not infiltrate the New York Times. This was actually happening. And then I had my plot. If they could do this in Nelson, Georgia, what would happen if the United States Congress tried to pass a similar law? What would happen if the United States Congress tried to introduce a bill and tried to pass a law that mandated, required, compelled every single American citizen to own a gun with sensible exceptions for children under the age of 7? And so that was my storyline. That was my plot. And I began writing and writing and writing. Now, I had a front seat in the back rooms of Capitol Hill to the dynamic and to the debate. And sitting in a front seat in the back rooms, I wrote on this, as I did on the Global War on Morris, because things were happening in real time. I remember sitting in an Appropriations Committee markup where we were talking about funding the Department of Homeland Security, and we tried to pass an amendment that's called No Fly, No Buy, that said if the federal government believes that you are too dangerous to fly on an airplane, you shouldn't be able to buy a military-style assault weapon. And we were trying to pass this amendment, and I'm listening to my colleagues argue against this measure, despite the fact that 85% of the American people supported it, despite the fact that a majority of NRA members supported it. And as I was listening to my colleagues argue against this, I just began to write down what I was listening to because it was so absurd. And I thought it would make great prose. And so I was accustomed to kind of writing in real time on this, and then, of course, polishing and editing and editing. And my colleagues realized that I was doing this. share one example with you, one anecdote that has the advantage of being true. For those of you who don't know this, there's a beautiful little balcony off the floor of the House. It's my favorite place on Capitol Hill. Democrats and Republicans could be thrashing each other on the floor of the House, but then they can walk out to this little balcony. On one side is the Library of Congress, the Supreme Court. On the other side is the National Mall, the Washington Monument. Beyond that, the Lincoln Memorial. The 3 House office buildings in front. Narrow little veranda with cheap patio furniture, and you could just sit there and relax. And that's where I did a lot of my writing. I'd walk off the floor and start writing. And one of my former colleagues is a Republican from Missouri named Billy Long. Billy Long, one of my favorite members of Congress. He and I disagreed on almost every single thing. Billy Long was an auctioneer before he went to the House of Representatives. Big, garrulous guy with these just puffy jowls. Came out on the members' balcony and saw me pounding on this, and he said, "Israel, you writing another book about us?" And I said, "Billy, I am." He said, "Well, what's this one about? I love Morris." He actually loved the global war on Morris. I said, "Well, Billy, tentative title is Big Guns. Let me ask you a question, Billy. What if the United States Congress decided to try and pass a law that mandated gun ownership for every single American, whether they want a gun or not? And if you don't have a gun, you get fined." And he kind of massaged his jowls, and he looked at me and he said, "You mean we haven't done that yet?" And I thought, oh my Lord, what have I done? What have I done? He's going to introduce the bill. And then he thought about it, and he said, you Democrats passed Obamacare, which forced every American to have health insurance. Why shouldn't we pass a bill that requires every American to have life insurance? Because guns save lives. Now, this is a legitimate and valid opinion of Billy Long, and it's shared by many of my colleagues. And as he said that, I said, "Billy, hold on. Could you just repeat that? Because I got to get this in the book." And it is, I think, on page 71. The book was a critical success, I'm happy to say. Got great reviews. You heard Nancy share with you Christopher Buckley's review of it. And it was optioned to Hollywood, and they got an investor to invest in a screenplay. The screenplay's been written by a guy named Josh Stern, who wrote the screenplay for a wonderful Kevin Costner film several years ago called Swing Vote, about one guy, one American, who forgot to cast his vote for President of the United States. And they have to actually redo the election, and it all comes down to this one guy, played by Kevin Costner. Let me just wrap up by talking about where we are now on the issue of gun violence. We had a shooting in San Diego. We now have a war erupting within the National Rifle Association. This is all, current news. And the question remains, will Congress do anything on this issue? And I think the answer is, in the House, things will be done. In the Senate, I'm sure if Ron Wyden had his way, sensible things would be done. But with the current crowd running the Senate, the answer is no. Nothing is going to be done on gun safety, and certainly in this administration, nothing is going to be done on gun safety. So in the near term, legislation is not going to solve this problem, but an informed electorate will. And that is why I wrote Big Guns. I wanted to inform the electorate about the dynamic of this issue in an absurd and comical way, hoping that the use of satire would help educate, would make the point, and would lead to a better outcome than the one we have now. And so again, I want to thank Nancy for giving me the opportunity to join with you at the Strand tonight. And we have copies of the book, and don't know if there are any questions, but this is intimate, so we can have a conversation, or I can just sign some copies, whatever you prefer. Thank you all very much. Nancy, you have a question.
Do you think that members of the Congress are afraid of the NRA people as kind of crazy people that will hunt them down and their lives are at stake?
I'll answer your question with a true experience that I had. One of the most honest places on Capitol Hill is the members-only elevator. During votes, because when there are votes, the members-only elevator means members only. So no press, no family, no staff, no interns, no guests, nobody but members. And so when those doors close, there is a level of true confidentiality because you can't be overheard. Now, I told you about that Appropriations Committee meeting when we were trying to offer an amendment that said, called No Fly, No Buy. And the amendment was defeated in a party line vote. Every Republican voted against the amendment. All but one Democrat voted for it. And then the bells rang in the Appropriations Committee, which meant there was a vote on the floor of the House. We emptied out of the chamber, filed into the members-only elevator, doors closed, jam-packed like sardines. And one of my former colleagues, a Republican, said, "Thanks for trying to jam us with that vote." What does that mean? Well, they thought that the vote was a gotcha vote, that we were trying to embarrass them. They voted against no fly, no buy. They were caught between their pro-gun constituents and the majority of the people of their districts who support that kind of common sense legislation. And my response was, that wasn't meant to jam you. I don't understand your politics. I know your districts. I was the chairman of the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee. The majority of your constituents, about 80% of your constituents, support no fly, no buy. And you just voted against that 80% for the other 20%. Explain that to me. And this former colleague said, "Oh, no, I support no fly, no buy. I wish I could have voted for it. But if I did, I'd catch a primary from a gun lobby financed candidate. And there is no issue more powerful in a Republican primary to use against me than guns. So you jammed me." And that explains everything that you need to know. That these members of Congress feel that they have to have this 100% fidelity to the gun lobby, or else they're going to face a primary, lose their seats, and their survival is paramount in their view.
So to follow up to that, what do you think we can do in the short term to try to combat that and actually do something to change it?
Well, it's a great question. What do I think should be done to combat that, and how do we change it? So here's the good news. In 2018, the midterm elections, two things happened. Number one, President Trump tried to litigate the midterm elections on two things, immigration and guns. So he made guns a big deal in the midterm election, lost that litigation, actually. Democrats picked up 40 seats. The other thing that happened is that gun safety groups actually outspent the NRA for the first time in any election in recorded history. So I think we may be at a tipping point now, and we should be. Particularly when we're not talking about repealing the Second Amendment. We're not talking about confiscating people's weapons. We're talking about no fly, no buy. We're talking about strengthened background checks. We're talking about just making it a little bit more difficult for somebody who should not have a gun to get a gun. Not making it any more difficult for somebody who has the right to have a gun and is responsible to carry one. So when you're talking about those issues, it's no wonder that a majority of NRA members support those common sense measures. It's no wonder that a vast majority of Americans support those common sense measures. It is beyond wonder that the United States Congress up to now has been so far behind the American public. But I think that the dynamic is changing, and more members of Congress are understanding that they've got to do something about this. Will it happen in the near term? As I said before, not in this administration. But I'm optimistic that over the next 2, 3, 4 years, you may be able to see some fundamental change in this. Yeah?
So what were your thoughts on the Florida teacher gun bill? Do you think it's going to have a precedent or set a precedent for other states?
Well, the bill that arms teachers, yeah. Look, I don't believe that people become teachers in order to carry weapons, number one. I mean, that's number one. Number two, putting more guns in classrooms is not the answer to making classrooms safer. And so to me, it's just common sense. You make it harder for anybody who is willing to purchase a gun or acquire a gun and bring it to a school and shoot it should not have a gun. So the answer is not to put more guns in classrooms and make those classrooms more dangerous. The answer is to make schools safer by making it harder for people who shouldn't be able to get those guns to get them and go to a school. I'm deeply concerned that it's going to set a precedent, particularly in the political environment we're in. I've seen some polling on this. This is another thing where the vast majority of Americans disagree with this as a solution. Vast majority of Americans disagree. Another example of where some policymakers are just behind the common sense of the American people.
How's Mayor Bloomberg doing with his gun initiative?
So Mayor Bloomberg, started Main Street, one of several really important and vital organizations, and he has focused. I think it's a really interesting and correct strategic decision. He made the calculation. His group made the calculation that there will be no progress on this issue in Washington, D.C. That the progress to be made was state and local. And so they are very active in trying to pass state and local laws and ordinances that will keep us safer. And I think that makes sense. And so really when you look at it, the progress that has been made, as I said earlier, the progress that has been made at the state and local level. So you've got, to your question, you've got some states that are making it even easier for the wrong people to buy guns. But you also have many state and local governments that are trying to make it a little bit more difficult, that are trying to pass these common sense measures. The problem with the whole debate over state and local versus federal is you can buy a military-style assault weapon on the internet, and get it in the states with the strictest laws. You can buy a weapon in Georgia and drive it up I-95 and have it in Manhattan within a day or so, which is why you ultimately have to have some federal standards on this issue, and that's the point that I was trying to make with big guns. One other thought on this, what I really enjoyed about, as I wrote Big Guns, was not just the bringing real-life characters and real-life dialogue into it, but making this subtle point. In the book, nobody believes that this law, the American Freedom from Fear Act, which compels every American to own a gun, nobody believes it's a good idea. The Republican President of the United States thinks it's a horrible idea. The Speaker of the House thinks it's an awful idea. The Majority Leader of the Senate thinks it's an awful idea. But they're afraid of the politics. And so the Speaker of the House says, look, this is nuts, this bill. And by the way, the Speaker of the House in Big Guns, is a guy who's a chain smoker and a wine drinker. Might have a resemblance to John Boehner. You make the judgment. You make the judgment. And so he says, this is nuts, this bill. He said, but I can't keep this. I can't keep this hold up. I'm going to have to pass this. But don't worry, the Senate's going to defeat it. Senate Majority Leader has this bill. He says, no. We're going to pass it in the Senate. So, Mr. Speaker, you bottle it up. And they have this dynamic. And then they agree. I'm not going to give away the whole thing, but then they agree, look, we have nothing to worry about. We can pass it, and the president's going to veto it. And then the president has to deal with it. And the president goes, don't pass this bill. It's crazy. And so he has his politics. So I was trying to make the point that, how our laws are made, sometimes everybody knows the law's a bad law, but they still get made. And that's what happens on the issue of gun violence. Second thing I want to add to that is I didn't want to make this just a dynamic in Washington, D.C. I wanted to make it local. I wanted to build in relationships. And so the book really revolves around the relationship between a gun lobbyist named Sunny McCarthy, very successful, dynamic, powerful woman in Congress who is a gun lobbyist, and her mother, who's a small-town mayor on eastern Long Island, who wants to restrict guns from her village, and how they deal with that. What's the family dynamic? And so the intersection of the family dynamic and the political dynamic, I think, made for a richly contented book. Go ahead. Yeah. Go ahead.
I was just wondering, were you concerned about writing a satirical novel on such a traumatic issue in the States?
Yeah, that's a great question.
For the parent of a child who died in Sandy Hook, read this.
Yes, it's a wonderful question. Was I worried about taking on such a traumatic issue in a satiric way? And so I had several conversations with people whose lives were disrupted by gun violence. In fact, I will tell you that one of the characters, Lois Leibowitz, is named after a woman named Lois Schaefer, whose daughter was murdered in St. Louis, Missouri, several years ago. And I sat with her and said, this is what I'm thinking of. And she and others said, we've got to use every tool we have to educate members of Congress. And if they're not going to listen to us, maybe they'll listen to you. So write the book. But there was I did want to be sensitive to this. And so the book is snarky, but I made sure it was not exploitive. And I think it has the right balance. I hope it has the right balance. The book has been very well received. I mean, the Brady campaign distributed the book to its members. Giffords didn't distribute the book to all of its members, but they took a look at it and sent it to some folks. And so I wanted to make sure that there was consensus that the book was not going to hurt anybody's feelings unless you are a member of Congress who knows better and still votes the wrong way. I don't mind hurting their feelings.
When my mother came from Madison, Wisconsin to New York, she dreamed of living in Levittown, and just wanted to know what that was like growing up and how your parents ended up there.
So Levittown is the quintessential suburb. It was like the first suburb of America. And so when I was born in Brooklyn and 2 years old, my parents schlepped us to Levittown on a GI Bill. Bought their first house for something like $14,000. And it was a very homogeneous community. And it was in Levittown that I began to write, actually. When I was in 4th grade, I started to write in this little Levitt house. I went to a high school. I went to General Douglas MacArthur High School. Now, I've never been able to verify this, but there's kind of a legend that the Levittown School Board, Levittown Board of Education, was debating whether to call my high school Senator Joseph McCarthy High School. Now, that may seem absurd to you, but Levittown, the Levittown School District, was one of those school districts that actually had book burnings. They took books off the shelves of the library, and they burned them. So it was an interesting place to grow up, very interesting place to grow up. But it gave me my interest in politics. I remember, I can tell you the day I decided to run for Congress. It was in 4th grade at Gardner's Avenue Elementary School. And there was an announcement on the PA system. They had these PA announcements, and in the morning I was sitting there in my 4th grade class, and suddenly there was an announcement by the principal of the school. Never heard the principal make an announcement. He announced that Senator Robert Kennedy had died overnight. He had been shot, and he had died overnight. And it may seem morbid, but in 4th grade I began thinking, well, why would somebody want to hurt somebody else because of their ideas? Because they were, running for president. What is that about? And it became really, and I said, I want to get involved in politics. That's not fair. I want to do something about it. And I became addicted to the news and began writing. Levittown was really instrumental in shaping my ambition to run for Congress and to write at the same time. Well, thank you again for. Okay, sure.
Now that you're not in Congress, how do you get material for other books? Are you looking at C-SPAN?
Yeah, I'm kind of addicted to C-SPAN. It's kind of sad, actually. There must be some medication for that. So it's a fascinating question. So here's the challenge that I think exists today that we've got to do something about. It's a very tough market for political satire, to be very honest with you. And why is that? Because we're surrounded by free satire, right? So every tweet is funny and sad. You can get what you think is satire by tuning into late night talk shows. It's not satire, that's parody. That's not satire. Parody is, a rim shot, ba-dum-bum, right? Makes fun of something or somebody. Satire is a nuanced argument. It draws you in. It's complex. It takes time to flesh it out. That's really what satire is. When you think about, so who are the great literary patriots in America? Well, Joseph Heller, Catch-22. It was a satire, really, of Vietnam. Mark Twain, satire of slavery. Christopher Buckley, the preeminent satirist in America today, wrote "Thank You for Smoking" and "Little Green Men," satirized Washington, White House mess about, interestingly, about based on President Reagan refusing to leave the White House after his term expired. After 8 years. And so satirists, I think, are true patriots because they're able to draw you into a market or draw you into an idea without beating you over the head with it, take you through it, and let you make judgments based on your exposure to the content. The challenge now, because of our political environment, is it's tough. I have ideas every single day on what I want to poke fun at. What I want to satirize. But it is a really tough market. Now, I think the market's going to recover, and I think it recovers over the next several years. And when it recovers, I think there'll be a wave, and people are going to be like, oh, yes, I remember how good that felt. But for now, it's despite the many ideas and concepts for satiric work, it's not as easy as it may have been in the past to turn that into a book that's going to sell. All right, well, thank you all for coming. Appreciate it very much. And let's thank Nancy for her hospitality here at the Strand. Thank you.